In part 1 we was looking at that experiment with a black and white card, but perhaps just to finish off, let's take a look at this again with real images, because it's one thing to demonstrate dramatically how the camera can be fooled, but we don't often take photos of a black or a white card. So let's start with our 18% grey. Now we're looking at our grey card on screen, but I quite often call it a grey card. Forgive me for doing that, it's just that back in my film days it used to be a physical grey card which I carried around with me, and in tricky lighting conditions it can be used to take a light meter reading. Now I've placed my 18% grey card, there I go with the card, in the middle of the screen as our control. And we're going to look first at a picture we used in another video which you may remember. Now when we frame up on a scene like that, the camera's light meter looks at the scene and it takes a series of meter readings from all different places. Then it reduces them to an average. Well, we can do much the same here. I'm going to remove the color from this image and I'm going to blur it in my image editor so that the tones are smoothed out into an average, much like our camera sees it. And look at the result. The grey tone is a perfect match for the 18% grey, and that is what our light meter is looking for. That's why the image was so well exposed. It matched almost perfectly what our cameras are calibrated for. But what happens if we look at a different example? Not quite so extreme as our white card, but let's do the same thing as before and compare the tones with this to what the camera may see. Now let's pause here for a moment and consider what this is telling us. Had we framed up on the misty morning scene, which was brighter than most images are likely to be, our camera's light meter just sees this light grey tone. It sees this as an overexposed image and it tries to adjust it back to 18% grey. The camera either adjusts the exposure itself if we've used an auto exposure setting, or it guides us to do the same thing via the exposure scale if we've used a manual setting. The result? An underexposed image, unless we're aware of this potential and use exposure compensation, the histogram and or the LCD on the back of the camera to make sure we don't fall into this trap. Let's continue and look at another image. This was shot on a beach as the moon was rising. Now just remember our black card as we look at the average we get when we take away the color and blur this particular image. It's the same thing we saw with the previous image, but in reverse, and much the same as our black and white cards. All the camera sees is a darker than normal image, and it makes exposure adjustments to raise the tone to the brighter 18% grey. But the result for us, if we do not step in and compensate, would be an overexposed image. So let me go round and fill in the rest of the images I've prepared here, because I think the exposure is going to be fairly predictable. Starting with this one, very similar to our misty morning picture, it's predominantly light tone. So if we look at this as the camera may see it, we're going to see something like that. So once again, unless we step in and compensate, we're going to get a picture that is badly underexposed. Here's another, and I think I could predict how this is going to turn out. It's very similar to the image we saw top left, and sure enough, when we average things out, we can see the grey from an exposure point of view at least is virtually identical. Very, very slightly different, but nothing significant. When we look at the next shot, what do we see? Something that's overall dark. Shot in a rainforest, lots of dark areas in the background, so unless we do something here, the camera is likely to overexpose this shot. And when we do the averaging, we can see exactly what it does, much the same as it did up on the top right to our moonlit beach scene. Here's another one which I think is going to come out pretty well right. So when we average the exposure here, I think we're going to see something pretty close to 18% grey, and sure enough we do. And finally, well, we've got another shot similar to our misty morning, but this one does have a few more dark tones in it. So when we do the same here, we can see we've got quite a light tone, so there's going to be a tendency here for underexposure, but it's certainly not going to be quite as much as the one at the top middle or the left middle, or in fact the white card we looked at earlier. Now, the thing that we enthusiast photographers do more than many others is that we do tend to be more turned on by those lighting conditions, scenes and subjects that aren't average. Who wants to be average all the time? So if any photographer is likely to fall foul of these issues, it's us. Once we get a feel for how the light meter in our camera works, and we tend to get to a position then where when we step up to a scene we're about to photograph, before we raise the camera to our eye, we've already got a good idea that we may have to look carefully at the exposure, then the consistency of our photography is going to improve considerably.